Walking through the park that day was just part of my usual route. I loved jogging in the early morning, when the cool and fresh air, the deserted park alleys, gave me the freedom and opportunity to change my thoughts. The sky was brightening, promising a sunny day, and I enjoyed every stride, feeling the tension leave my body with each step. After running a few laps, I slowed down on the wooden benches to catch my breath a bit. My gaze wandered around the neighborhood until I noticed a man presenting himself to me. Tall, confident, with short dark hair and piercing eyes, he resembled a graceful statue brought to life amidst the morning silence. The stranger whispered directly to me, and I felt my heart quicken its rhythm. Something in his gaze was inexpressibly familiar, as if he hadn't seen me, someone he'd lost long ago. "Good morning," he said with a slight smile, and his voice seemed to envelop me. "You look so much like someone I used to know." I looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to say, but his eyes held me in place. It was more than just a quick glance, his interest felt so clear that it almost made me uncomfortable. It appeared that he saw something intimate and inaccessible to contact in me. We stood in silence until I found the strength to break the silence. "Sometimes people do look alike," I said, feeling a slow stirring of curiosity. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he answered with a smile, his gaze conservative and seemed to hide 1,000 untold stories. We talked for a while and I learned that he frequents this park, though we had not crossed paths here before. Daniel confessed that he had lost his wife a few years ago, a beautiful, kind wife who had meaning in his life. He wasn't used to talking about it, but in a strange way, I seemed to have awakened a long-silenced pain in him. "I rarely meet people who remind me so much of her," he said, looking at me carefully. "You see, she was everything to me, and I couldn't just forget her." "But you," he was silent, as if he didn't dare to finish. His words struck me. Had he found some glimmer of her in my face? But, on the other hand, something inside told me that it was more than a mere resemblance. There was a subtle attraction between us that defied reason, as if fate had brought us to each other at this moment. As we continued walking, I felt strangely calm and excited at the same time. He walked beside me, and I felt the warmth of his presence. With each step, a tension grew between us that didn't need words to express itself. The park was a silent witness to our silent dialogue, and only the birdsong broke the strange magic. We reached small fields where the sun's rays broke through the branches of the trees, creating a golden light as if a fairy tale spell. Daniel stopped and turned to me, his eyes darker, filled with the very pain and hope he seemed to have kept deep all these years. "Somehow I feel like I met you for a reason," he said, looking me carefully in the eyes. "Maybe this is a chance to conquer what I thought was forever lost." His words awakened a host of vivid emotions in me. I felt him burning through me, as if he could see my thoughts and gaze and couldn't take his eyes off me. My heart pounded, and I couldn't hide the slight blush that trailed down my cheeks. "It's weird," I whispered, feeling short of breath. I didn't think it was a coincidence that we'd met, either. In the blink of an eye, we were in this little corner of the park, cut off from the rest of the world. He took a step toward me, and his hand gently touched mine, as if testing whether I was a real person or just a vision. We stood like that for a few moments, and I felt like the whole world had stopped. "You're amazing," he said softly, a note of pain mixed with hope in his voice. "When I look at you, I feel like life makes sense again." I didn't know what to say. I was swept up in a wave of his emotions, his suffering and his condition to regain what he thought was lost forever. But I was not her replacement, I was different. Yet, despite that, I was willing to understand and accept him. "Let's just savor this moment," I said, feeling it was the right thing to do. Maybe life sometimes gives us encounters like this so that we can find something bigger than ourselves. He smiled, and as if accepting that, he took my hand, and we walked back down the path, no longer as strangers, but as two people who had been given a chance at a new story. When his hand gently touched my cheek, I felt a wave of warmth spill over my body, mixed with an unexpected thrill. We sat next to each other on a park bench after our morning run, and the conversation with him once came back as if someone had opened the long-locked doors of my soul. Jack started talking about his wife. He couldn't shut out the warmth that shone through in his voice. His words were filled with such tenderness that it made me uncomfortable. He described her as a woman who could evoke the brightest and deepest feelings with just one look. She was extraordinary, he said quietly, lowering his eyes. She had such rare grace. But now, I noticed his lips trembling, and a shadow of sorrow shadowed his gaze for a moment. As if apologizing, he added quickly, "I'm sorry, you're just something like her." There was so much pain in his gaze, I felt like I was peeking into an intimate part of his life. And that pain was suddenly mine. I think to hide the words, remembering how rarely I'd heard such words spoken to me. A strange mixture of warmth and longing came over me. I used to think I knew how to keep to myself, but now all the feelings came to the surface. It was a moment of vulnerability that I was afraid to reveal, even to myself. Finally, I gathered my strength and, with an intermittent sigh, admitted, "You know, I haven't felt this way in a long time." He looked at me as if waiting for me to continue. And I, surprised at my own frankness, whispered, 7 years ago, I made a mistake. I betrayed my husband, and he left me. It's gone, but every time I think of him, it hurts just as much." Jack looked at me with genuine sympathy. His hand touched mine, his fingers gently wrapped around mine as if protecting me. The touch was warm, tentative, but there was a strength in it that seemed to remind me that there were still people in the world who could accept you for who you were, despite the mistakes and the weight of the past. The fingers of his hand slid gently over my wrist, slowly moving up to my forearm. His actions were confident but cautious, as if he sensed the fragility of the moment and didn't want to ruin what had happened between us. He looked at me, and there was something in his eyes that made me swoon with overwhelming emotion. Every touch of his hands on my skin left traces of warmth that penetrated deeper and deeper. Suddenly he moved closer, so that his breath was touching my cheek. He leaned in, keeping his gaze fixed on me, and, breathless, he brushed his lips softly against my cheek. It was a simple kiss, but there was so much care and control in it that I felt a long-forgotten warmth spill into my chest. His hands rested gently on my shoulders, and for a moment it was as if it had stopped. He looked me in the eyes again and, taking my hand, said, "You know, you're the real deal. What you're saying, the way you're opening up is lucky." His voice sounded soft, but you could hear the confidence in it that was so rare. I watched his face, absorbing every word, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something more had happened between us than just a chance encounter in the park. His touch, his gaze, and his warmth made me feel more alive than I'd ever felt before. Through all the grass, he led me to a small log, drowning in the soft sunlight that filtered through the trees. Each step through the soft, slightly damp grass felt like something almost unreal. He walked beside me, and the sensation of his presence awakened such an inner awe in me that I barely exuded breath. We stopped at the edge of the clearing, and without averting his gaze, he said something I barely caught, but realized it was a compliment. It was so natural and yet so surprising that something inside me trembled. His fingers rested on my arm, and that touch alone sent a wave through me that felt like a light machine discharge. We stood side by side, alone, and I felt all my senses heighten. The closeness of his body, his light breath touching my face, all of it merged into a single moment that was impossible to pull away from. Each touch, a light touch, seemed to awaken something deep and unknown in me. His fingers slowly slid down, traveling down my wrist, and I caught myself wishing he'd never let me go. His touch felt warm, so strong that I felt like I was losing my temper. But something was still holding me back, an invisible thread that reminded me that it wasn't that simple, that it could break at any moment. He moved closer, and I felt his hand rest gently on my shoulder, then slowly move upward. His thumb gently stroked my skin, as if exploring every millimeter of it. There was something in that movement that awakened me, as if I myself had become part of our nature, intertwining with them on another, deeper level. His breathing quickened, and I felt my heart begin to beat in time with his breath. He slowly leaned toward me, snuggling so close that I felt the warmth of his lips on my cheek. The sensation alone made me want to lose myself in his arms, to let myself succumb to the frenetic wave that took me over. But I tried to hold myself together, hiding the storm that raged inside. His eyes were filled with desire and a kind of inexpressible tenderness that made me sink even deeper into the moment. He moved closer, his arm around my waist for a moment, and I felt his strength, as if the very air around us had become denser, enclosing us in an irresistible opposition. His touch was soft, but there was a frenetic energy in it that literally took over my body. I couldn't hold in a barely audible sigh as his fingers slid a little lower, and the warmth of his palm pressed against my back, as if enveloping me in a protective cocoon. We both knew that this closeness, this instant connection, was something that words couldn't explain. His touch made my heart beat so hard that it felt like just a little more, and I couldn't hide my state. When he leaned toward me again, our eyes met, and I realized he was thinking of the same look. There was an almost palpable thread between us, so fragile yet powerful that I was afraid to move lest I ruin the moment. His words, hidden in a whisper, seemed to grow distant in the silence of the surrounding forest. "You're the best woman I've ever met in my life." His voice was deep, a little husky, and I felt like he was saying it not only to me, but to himself, like a revelation. His palms encircled my shoulders, moving gently, exploring every inch of me, and I knew I was pulling back too late. When it was over, I was incredibly happy, and all he could do was whisper in my ear, "Thank you." We lay on the grass, trying to keep this moment in our memories, as if it could last forever. The warmth of his hands in my arm felt more real than anything I'd ever felt before. We talked about life, about losses and occasional victories, revealed dreams and desires to each other, seemingly under the dead stars of no time or boundaries. He laughed, recalling the story of his childhood, and I laughed with him, immersing myself in his world, filling it to the brim. At such moments it seemed as if our souls were merging, that he saw something in me that no one had ever seen before. I wanted to believe that it was present, that he would be there for me, now and always. His words, so sincere, seemed like a vow, "We will be together. I want to be with you. You've become the light I've been looking for so long." I listened to him, afraid of the intruder and the magic of the night, and he didn't seem to want to miss this moment either. We made plans together like children, full of hope for the future, as if our tomorrow was bright and clear. He leaned toward me, his lips sliding over my temple and then down to my neck, left behind by the exposure to the warmth that lingered even after his touch. Suddenly he looked at me seriously, as if deciding something for himself. "I'll come for you tomorrow," he said. "I don't want us to lose each other. We'll always be together, we promise." I stared into his eyes, feeling the words grow cold and hope slowly spill through my veins. But I had no reason to doubt, I wanted to believe. When we finally said goodbye, I left with a light heart, feeling loved and needed. All I had to do was wait for tomorrow. But the next day passed without him. And another. Week after week I waited for a call, a message, some sign. But nothing came, and each day of waiting seemed to burn away that hope in me, slowly turning it into a bitter emptiness. My thoughts were racing, trying to find an explanation. Maybe something had happened? Maybe I'd done something wrong? But he never called. A few months passed, and that clearing where we shared our dreams became only a distant memory, a bitter illusion of something that seemed like it might become reality. It was as if someone had stolen that bright future, leaving me alone, with a heavy weight on my heart. Now I was just a shadow of myself, flitting between past and present, feeling the emptiness of his silence seep into me like a retarded poison.